everyone. So the next topic which we will be discussing here is about the exchange of gases during the respiration. So what is the purpose of breathing? The purpose of breathing is to provide a continual supply of oxygen and to continuous removal of carbon dioxide. So in these slides, we will be discussing about the pulmonary and the systematic gas exchange, where oxygen and the carbon dioxide are diffused from areas of high partial pressure to the areas of the low partial pressure. Now, start with the introduction first, that alveoli are the primary sites of exchange of gases. So alveoli that is present in the lungs, they are the primary sites of the gas exchange. So the exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissues. O2 and CO2, they are exchanged in these sites by simple diffusion, and they are mainly based on the pressure concentration gradient. So as you can see in this diagrammatic representation, there is a alveolar air, that is the partial pressure here is about 104 mmHg and the partial pressure of CO2 is about 440 mmHg. There is a pulmonary artery and there is a pulmonary vein which is being shown here. So the arrows are given here about how the oxygen is coming in and the carbon dioxide is being going out. Then there is a systematic arteries that is carrying the oxygenated blood, and here the partial pressure is about 95 mmHg and the partial pressure of CO2 is about 40 mmHg. It will be circulated in the body tissues and the carbon dioxide is being released from here. So the carbon dioxide is released through the systematic veins which is carrying the deoxygenated blood. And here you can see the partial pressure of oxygen is about 40 mmHg and the partial pressure of CO2 is about 45 mmHg. So that from here that will go into the pulmonary artery and there will be an expired air which is being presented here. So the exchange of gases also occurs between the blood and tissues. So as you can see in this diagram, that is by the process of simple diffusion based on the pressure and the concentration gradient. Solubility of the gases as well as the thickness of the membrane that is involved in the diffusion, there are also some important factors that can affect the rate of the diffusion. So there are some factors that will affect the rate of the diffusion. So it was being represented in the previous slide as well, but this is a much detailed view that how this process is going on. So as you can see, here the air is being inspired and the expired. So air inspired is the oxygen and the expired is the carbon dioxide. So from here, from the trachea, that is the windpipe, it will go inside the lungs, and from here there will be an exchange of gases in the lung in the alveolus, and the so for example, there is a capillary gas exchange and alveoli gas exchange. So these are being represented here, and the heart which pumps the blood, it will be transferred to various organs through veins and arteries. So there is a gas exchange, capillary and the alveolus gas exchange which are taking place. So now we will be discussing about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide is being governed by two gas laws, that is the Dalton's law and the Henry's law. So Dalton's law, it is the partial pressure of each gas in a mixture of gases which exerts pressure which is known as the partial pressure, and that is equal to the pressure the gas would exert if it were the only gas present. So the total pressure of the mixture is the sum of the partial pressure of all the gases that are present. So that is the Dalton's law. Now if we talk about the Henry's law, then it is the quantity of gas that will dissolve in a liquid, and it is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility. And here the temperature will remain constant. So the solubility is constant and the temperature of the blood, it does not vary significantly. So the concentration of a gas which is dissolved in a fluid depends directly on its partial pressure in the gas mixture. So if here we take an example here, that atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 mmHg, and there is about 21% oxygen by volume in the atmosphere. So the partial pressure of oxygen is about 0.21 into 760, that is around 160 mmHg. So if we say there is a 20% oxygen that is present, so it will be 0.1, and there is a atmospheric pressure at the sea level which is the 760, so it will be equal to 160 mmHg into mmHg. So it is into, that is equal to 160 mmHg. So this is the value of the partial pressure of oxygen that is being represented in the previous slide as PO2, that is the partial pressure of the oxygen, because it is the portion of the atmospheric pressure contributed by the O2. So if we take similar example as of nitrogen, so in case of the nitrogen, it constitutes about 78% of the atmosphere, so its partial pressure would be 0.78 into 760, that will be equal to 593 mmHg. So here the partial pressure of CO2 is much less than only 0.2 mmHg at the sea level. So the partial pressure of O2 is much less. Now we will be discussing about the two gas exchange here, that is the systematic gas exchange and the pulmonary gas exchange. So in pulmonary gas exchange, what is happening? In pulmonary gas exchange, there is a blood which passes through the lungs, and it picks up the oxygen and gives the carbon dioxide simply by the diffusion down the pressure gradient between the blood and the alveoli. So the blood that is entering the pulmonary capillaries of the lungs is pumped through the pulmonary arteries. So this blood is having just returned from the body tissues through systematic veins into right atrium, and it is relatively low in oxygen with a partial pressure of about 40 mmHg. That was being represented in the diagram, that there I represented that PO2 is about 40 mmHg, and it is relatively high in carbon dioxide, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46 mmHg. So as this blood flows through the pulmonary capillaries, it is supposed to be the alveolar air. So because the alveolar partial pressure is 100 mmHg, that is higher than the partial pressure of oxygen of 40 mmHg in the blood which is entering the lungs, oxygen diffuses down its partial pressure from the alveoli into the blood until there is no further gradient which exists. So as the blood it leaves the pulmonary capillaries, it has a partial pressure which is equal to the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen which is at 100 mmHg. So this was about the pulmonary gas exchange. So after leaving the lungs, the blood which has now about partial pressure of oxygen of about 100 mmHg and a partial pressure of CO2 is about 40 mmHg, it is returned to the heart and then pumped out to the body tissues such as systematic arterial blood. So this is about the pulmonary gas exchange. In the previous diagrams, I have represented all this in a gist form, like what is happening in the what is happening at the partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of uh, carbon dioxide, and how the process goes on. So the arrows in the figure represented how this how is the air is being, how is the gas exchange is being done. from the oxygen to carbon dioxide, how the pressure, partial pressure is changing, and how it has been pumped to all the parts of the body. Next is about the systematic gas exchange. So in case of systematic gas exchange, there is, for example, like the case of the pulmonary capillaries, so there is the oxygen and the carbon dioxide which move between the systematic capillary blood and the tissue cells by simple passive diffusion down partial pressure gradient. So it will be by the passive diffusion. So the arterial blood that reaches the systematic capillaries is essentially the same blood that left the lungs by the means of pulmonary veins. So the arterial partial pressure of oxygen is 100 mmHg and the arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 mmHg. The same as alveolar partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So the cells, what are the cells? They are constantly, they consume the oxygen and they produce the carbon dioxide through the process of aerobic respiration in which the oxygen is required. So aerobic, which means oxygen is required for the process of the respiration. Now there is a cellular partial pressure of oxygen which averages about 40 mmHg and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 46 mmHg. Although these values are highly variable depending on the level of cellular metabolic activity. So this was also being represented in the diagram itself. So from this we can understand the amount of oxygen which is being transferred to the cell and the amount of carbon dioxide that is carried away from the cell both depend on the rate of cellular metabolism. So this was all about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. These are some of the references. Thank you.